okay. I need to share my screen. There we go. You guys can see my screen?
Yeah.
Cool. So this is something called, you might be familiar with it, you might not be. It's called Visual Studio Code, which is like sort of a lightweight software IDE that a lot of people use for web development. And so the existing prototype is built with something called React, which the professor is going to teach us about next week. So there are basically varying levels of complexity with React, where, you know, on the one hand, you can kind of just do it out of the box real simple and not lean completely into all of its functionality, or you can go more for the reason it's special is because in regular HTML you have to write all of your website at once and it's hard to change it. But in React you write little pieces of your website and you can compose it all together. So it's based around this model of building apps using what's called components. And components are like little building blocks, and you put them on top of each other and you get one big application. So to start, there is a way for, before I show you the existing app, I just want to show you a very, like, the most basic sort of React app looks like, which there's a nice utility called create React app, and right, so we could call it React demo. And what it does is it sets up all the boilerplate for a React project for you, including configuring something called Webpack, which comes with a development server, which you need for being able to look at your application to test it. It takes a second, but once it's installed, it's not too crazy. So like the app for the prototype was built out of using the create React app as sort of a demo, as the foundation. Can I? Yeah. So this is the project structure. There's this folder called node modules, which is basically just a collection of libraries that React needs. Something important is this package.json. It gives you these commands that you can use to test your app. But the most important thing is the actual app itself is right here. So it looks a lot like a regular web page, except there's a few funny things like this slightly different syntax for interpolating variables. But yeah, let's actually we can run this. So it's pretty simple. You just do npm start, and it spins up what's called a local development server. And this is a React app. So what you see right here, the spinny thing, comes from this app.js folder. So you can see where it says image logo. That's what this is. And then over here, app.css, like the way they make the logos spin, like that's right there. There's a couple things. So the app itself has to be rendered in what's called a root, but you don't have to worry about that so much. That's more part of, that's like React, the framework. This is just boilerplate. But the part that you write is this. And so yeah, so and you might notice I've been typing something called npm or npx or node. Those are all just ways of referring to what's called a package manager for managing dependencies that React needs. And yeah, when everything gets compiled, that's using something called Node.js. One thing you have to do is, like, when you're done with your app and you want to publish it, there's this thing called npm run build. And what it does is it takes all of the raw files and it does a couple of complicated things, but basically it crunches it all together and sort of transpiles it into like a compressed version, and you get something that looks like this, which is where your whole app, I think, is just here, which is very scary. It's not supposed to be human readable, but this is a React app. But that comes from here. So that's sort of like the basic way that React looks. Does that make sense? Or is there anything confusing? Okay. Let me just make sure the screen share. Yeah, okay, that's working. And I'll try to keep this fairly short, but it is a little bit complicated, so it might need like half an hour to go through. So this is the app for the prototype, which if we run it, looks a little bit different. So it's got this menu, and there's the all the different buttons you can press, and the styling is a little messed up, so it's really ugly. So one thing we can work on is like making the CSS better. But basically all of this comes from the same template as this much simpler one. Hide, I need to hide. There you go. So let's see. So we still have this thing called app.js, but it looks a little bit different. It's a lot bigger. And the most important thing to notice is that there is this thing called a router. And the router, all these routes, there's sort of like all the different pages in your app. And so each one of these URLs, or I guess paths is what they're called, they link to a component view. So like home. So like this page where it shows you all the buttons and everything. So like right now I'm at this profile path, and that's this. So it's this big menu. But what's important, and then the home thing is here, but what's important is that the profile and the home are both embedded inside of this bigger app container. So basically what these routes do is based on the path in the browser, it will show a different component. And There's a whole bunch of them. So there's one for the, the block, well, welcome and block list aren't really implemented yet, but like messages, like that one, that's this button over here. Notifications and invites, that's over there. It's one of those things we have to, based on the user study, you have to redo that a little bit. But so yeah, there's this thing called a router, which basically it takes a path and it routes the application to the component that goes with that path. And then there's this other really important thing, which is this concept of state. And state looks kind of scary because there's just a lot of it. It's not very complicated, but there's just a lot of data to keep track of. So like, let me find. So there are these things called, if you've done database classes or anything like that, you might know this idea of you have a table, and the table has different rows with different kinds of data. And so the analog to like a table in something like React and JavaScript is you'll have a model of something. So in this case, like when a student wants to sign up for a class like UI design, there will be a class model that has the details for that class. And then so the same thing applies. So like groups have a data model, and so a group will have a title and a subject and students who are in it and things like that. Messages, so like this is maybe a good example. And so if I go to groups and I ask to join a group and I type a message gets created and it will show up over here. And what's happening is basically the information here, so the fact that just in this example, the dummy profile is named Dave and I just send a message that says hello, those things live inside of an instance of a message model. And the only other thing is like student profile model, just to hammer the point home, if I go to my profile page, all of this information, this page just presents the information that lives in this model. And the thing that's tricky is React out of the box doesn't have this thing called global state, which is to say different parts of the application don't have access to the same data as other parts of the application. And so we actually have to use some secondary functionality to be able to share things like what is the name of the user who's logged into the application between all the different views and user flows. And so we do that through this thing called a global context. And so like the profile data is stored globally, the groups are stored globally. And the scary part, the really verbose part of app, all this stuff, the update my profile and add to my groups and remove from my groups and classes and everything, all of these are just functions that update the state inside of the global context. So it's all about sharing information. And so like you can see like groups, if I go to the groups page, each one of these groups is stored in this collection right here. And there's functionality for adding groups and removing groups. And like similarly, whenever I send a message, that goes there. And even like students in the student view, so like you can see there are 5 students in this class. Well, that might not actually be, yeah, so here's an example of a student, and here are his classes, and here are groups that he can join based on those classes. But again, he lives right here. So, and then all of this is just when you start from scratch, you don't have any data, so we make some pretend data. But basically what happens is, again, to summarize, for the structure, you have your app, which is like this big container, and then you have what's called a router, which lets you take paths, and the paths tell you which screen to render. So if I click the group button, I go to the group path. If I click the home button, I go to the home path. If I click the student button, I go to the student path, etc., etc., etc. And then once you're at that path in that view, the global context, which has all of the state for the application, so like group gallery, if we go to that page, you can see that we are past, this might need to be updated actually, but basically we have our group information, and what you do is you go through every single one of the groups and you render it, which is, it looks scary, but basically all that's happening is it's saying for every individual group in my big list, go here and render all this code is for so this right here is the view, and then once I click on a group, now I'm seeing the data for the group. And so this little circle, the circle is represented by this file. It's called a card. But the place where the circles live, that's called a view. That's in this gallery. But we can use things in React. This map function is kind of like it's like a loop. It lets you iterate over everything in the list and then render it. But and so this just happens over and over. It is kind of complicated to implement, but in terms of like the theory, it's not too bad. There's, so like the student stuff looks similar. So again, you just have like a list, and you're literally going through the array and you're making what are called cards for individual students. So in this case, here's a good example. It's this store, global context, consumer. A store is this idea of a place where you go to store things. It's for storage. And so inside of store, if you remember, when we were looking at app.js, we had students. So students are stored, and they belong to this object called store. So what you do inside of student gallery is you say, give me that store that's available globally, and then from that store, take all the students and render them. And putting a pin in it is, there's this idea in React that at the very top level, you have your big crazy container, this app that has all this data, and then you pass data from the very top all the way down into all the children components, which are routed to. And that's how you get this application. And there are some things, so like it can get pretty fancy, like, so layout can be contextual. So like right now we see these buttons, but if I go to my profile and I say, actually, I don't want to look for groups anymore, there's a piece of data that's saved that this page is aware of. But if I go home, there's a check and it says, if I'm not looking for groups, I won't show you the buttons. And so that's this idea of state in React getting shared between different views and being modified by different components. That's at a very high level, that's how this all works. And the only other thing is so the buttons, they look fancy and they have all these fancy transitions. That's because I've been using something called Material UI, which is this really cool, it's called a component library. And basically it's like kind of like I was mentioning components or building blocks. So other people, you can use other people's components, and so like literally there's just this big web page where it tells you all about all the different stuff you can use. So for example, when I was showing you that switch, this is the same switch, and you use it. There's code examples. So you import the switch and then you put it into your component, and if you look at the profile, that's exactly what's happening. Is there is a, yeah, so there it is. You import the switch, and then, oh, sorry. And then here's where it comes from, and there's some extra code for hooking it into changing the state. So again, the implementation becomes complicated, but the basic idea is you have this catalog of like buttons and avatar badges and chips and cards and things, and there's some simple code for getting it into your app, and then the complicated code is when you're hooking in the state. But yeah, so so React has this idea of you compose a complicated application out of lots of tiny parts, and you can make that process faster by using building blocks from something like a component library. And once you have your application, the way you distribute information is using this concept of state. But yeah, again, that's just like the very high level. So if you have was anything there confusing, or you have any questions, or you're curious about stuff?
I have no questions right now. I think I was pretty well explained at a high level. I just think for me personally to learn better, I just have to look at the code more.
Right.
But
Yeah.
with high level overview, it definitely is going to help to make that process easier. Appreciate it, man.
Yeah, of course. And I'll definitely, I can show it to you right now. The code just lives, it lives at, it's just a GitHub repository, and you can clone it, and there's like instructions on how to run it, and like you're saying, the best way is to just take some time playing with it and trying things out and tweaking things, and you figure things out quickly. So I'll stop the recording there, but I will send you the link